Good morning, church. My name is Patrick, and we'll be reading from Acts 16, verses 11 onwards. From Troas we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we travelled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us.
Paul, my bad. We began our series last week with Paul, and it was a kind of a biographical series, right? I want to give you this sense that you've kind of journeyed with Paul. And we saw something of Paul's zeal and Paul's sense that he was announcing that the Messiah, the King, had come, and the kingdom that the Jews had anticipated was arriving, and they needed to get on board, and the Gentiles were also invited to be a part of this kingdom. And today, I want to suggest to you that if you want to understand Paul's sense of kingdom, his ministry, his mission, another key factor you're going to have to understand is his relationship to females, to women. The most common feedback I got after last Sunday's sermon was, actually, I'm kind of a little bit more interested in Paul. To be quite honest, I don't like Paul, and I found him a misogynist. Now, that's not everybody's response. Perhaps some people like Paul because they think he is male-centric in his thinking. But it's a critique common of Paul, and there's some evidence as to why you might think that, right? I mean, here's some of the things he says. I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is man. Wives, submit to your husbands, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Wives should submit to their husbands. Women should remain silent in churches. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. And if they've got some questions, they should ask their husband at home. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I don't permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. Why? Because Adam wasn't deceived, it was Eve. Little tip for those of you who have social media, don't go home and put these verses on your post, all right? They will engender a voracious response. These kind of statements are out of step with our culture, and you can understand why some people, some women in particular, can find parts of Paul's message offensive. So, I want to give you kind of, as we continue this biographical approach to Paul, I want to give you a sense of why it is that I'm saying you need to understand Paul and his relationship to women in ministry, because that's critical to the success of his bringing the kingdom. So these are going to be our headings: women as spiritual, as influencers, as patrons, as deacons, as teachers and leaders, as submissive, and as equal image bearers. That's quite a number of points, so we better get cracking. This is what we read in today's passage. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, and we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and we spoke with the women who were gathered there. And one of those women was Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth, a worshipper of God. Now, remember Paul's sense of there's the king who has come and we're announcing a kingdom, And he tends to go where first when he goes to a new city? He goes to the synagogue. Why? Because he's saying to the Jewish people who are anticipating that the Messiah is coming, he has come. We kind of missed it, but it's okay. Jesus is that Messiah. Get on board. And so Paul is looking for the Jews in town, except there's no synagogue in Philippi. So where will the Jews be likely worshipping? And the answer is at a river. Why? Well, probably because at the river you can do some ceremonial washing and cleansing that might be part of gathering. Think about Psalm 133. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and we wept. How can we sing the Lord's songs? So there is this tradition of the Jews gathering at rivers and worshipping when there's no synagogue in town. And so Paul goes, I'm going to head down to the river. I'm going to find the spiritual people in town. And guess what? They're all women. There's only women there. Why are there no men? Don't know. But that's who's there. And there's one woman in particular who is highlighted as being spiritual, and that's Lydia. And she is a dealer in purple cloth, so she's a well-to-do woman, and she is what's translated in English as a worshipper of God, but probably could be slightly differently translated, perhaps as a pious spiritual woman. So this is a compliment, an affirmation of her character. She's a woman of means and she's a woman of character. And as we will discover in a moment, she is the first convert in Europe. Paul has crossed over the Bosphorus, and he's now on the opposite side. He's in Europe, and his first convert is a woman. And in fact, as we read on, he's going to go into Philippi, and there is another female who is spiritual, but this time she's got dark spirits in her, and she's some kind of a seer. But I think we're meant to kind of join some dots there, that Luke is portraying women as spiritual, and actually the people who get upset about the cessation of this woman's spiritual gifts are men, because they're interested in money and not in spiritual things, not in the well-being of this girl, right? And Luke is kind of just reinforcing both of those themes in these couple of chapters. And so what we're getting a sense here is that, and it's a little anecdotal at the moment, but it's that females are perhaps more spiritually in tune with this new movement that's kind of happening. If you have a look at the NCLS figures of our church, guess what? 60% of people who come to our church are female. And you know what? That is no different from any other church anywhere in the world. 60% of all Christians are female. In fact, 60% of all religions are female. Isn't that fascinating? And it leads some people to suggest that women have, on average, a higher spiritual IQ than males. Intelligence is a kind of a newish notion. So we started talking about IQ and how intellectually smart you were, and we measured that via IQ tests. And since then, we've started talking about multiple intelligences. And some people think there's 5, and some people think there's 8, and some people think there's 9. And whatever you happen to think, spiritual intelligence is one that some people talk about. And we have kind of evidence from our first century text, and we have evidence from 21st century attendance that there's something about spirituality that women tend to get more quickly. They tend to be more regular practitioners. They tend to be more integrated with their spirituality touching dimensions of their life. Let's read a bit more about Lydia. She's a worshipper of God. The Lord opens her heart to respond to Paul's message. And when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invites us, so Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke into her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. It's quite a little bit, and that's not just a few details, right? There's some stuff there for us to kind of mine out of that text. Firstly, there's no mention of a guy. She seems to be the leader of this household. It's her household. And she becomes a gatekeeper who invites Paul and Silas to come and evangelize her entire household. And actually, they all end up believing, following Lydia's leadership. And in addition to her being a kind of a spiritual gatekeeper, she also now is using her wealth and influence to kind of support Paul, to give him a place to live and a base from which to conduct his mission. And this is not unique. Just notice what Luke says in the next chapter. In Thessalonica, some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. Luke is intentionally highlighting that prominent women are overrepresented amongst the early converts. Exactly the same in Berea. Many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and Greek men. And he's putting the women before the men. That is not the thing you do in the first century. Fascinating, isn't it? I don't know if you've noted this. So we're getting this cumulative sense that women are influencers. They're kind of more in tune with the fact that there's some kind of a new spiritual movement that's happening. They get it a little bit quicker. And that's what happens in the Gospels too, isn't it? It's like, no, Jesus, you're not going to die. The women come and anoint Jesus and prepare him for his death. It's the women who hear about the resurrection first, and we are seeing the same themes now in Paul and in the book of Acts. And the women become channels. They open the gates and allow Paul and Silas and others to infiltrate into households and into communities and to share about Jesus being the king of this new kingdom. So women are spiritual, women are influencers, women are patrons. So Lydia is now also saying, I will financially prop you up and you can live in my house and my home becomes a platform for your ministry. And she's not alone. Let's jump over to Romans 16. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. I don't think we quite get how expensive first century ministry is. Paul is, yes, he's tent making, but he doesn't fully fund his own ministry. He tends to do it for a while and then he goes back to previous churches and gets a collection so that he can't be have his arm twisted behind his back by the wealthy people of the town that he's in, right? But in addition to that, he's writing letters. Now, he's not just jumping on a computer and punching out an email and hitting send. You've got to buy papyrus. You've got to buy ink. You've got to pay for a scribe. It's going to take you ages to write this thing, and there's probably a first draft and then a final version. And then you've got to pay somebody to carry it to the place where it's got to go, and you've got to make copies so that this letter can be distributed around the region. All of this means that any of Paul's letters cost in the tens of thousands of dollars. Who the heck do you think's paying for that? And the answer is, a substantial amount of that is being paid for by prominent women. They're funding this. So this Phoebe, and we'll come back to her later, but in Romans, Paul is saying to her at the last chapter where he does all the greetings, in particular, I'm starting with Phoebe. Welcome her. She has been a benefactor of many people, including me. And then he mentions Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla is the female. She's mentioned first. Why? Probably because she's of higher social status and their wealth and means is more as a result of her than it is of Aquila. She's described as a co-worker. That's quite an egalitarian term, isn't it? In Christ. They risk their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Priscilla and Aquila turn up in 3 places. They're in Corinth, they're in Ephesus, and they're in Rome. And they're wealthy. They let the church meet in their home. 90+ percent of the first century lives on the borderline of viability. All right? And they live in a house probably about the size of your bedroom, and maybe it's 2 stories, and there might be 5 or 10, 15 people living in that space. You can't have a church meet in a house like that. You've got to be very, very wealthy, in the top 1 or 2% of people, to own a big enough house to have a church come and meet in your house, and probably the meeting takes here, and then later on the Lord's Supper takes place in another room out the back. But there are these wealthy women who open up their homes and they become the buildings that are the churches, the early churches, when the Jews get kicked out of the synagogues, when Paul and Timothy and whoever can no longer evangelize in the synagogues. All right, let's continue on a little bit in Romans 16. Greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. Greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, these women who work hard for the Lord. And then a few verses on, greet my dear sister Persis, another woman who worked very hard for the Lord. So Romans 16 is just this list of friends, and Paul kind of mentions a whole bunch of them. And we're getting this cumulative sense again that women are workers, co-workers, busy, highly represented amongst the can-do people in the early church. In fact, Phoebe is called a deacon or a deaconess, and if we go to 1 Timothy 3, one of the ways you can translate that is Paul gives you the qualities you're looking for in a deacon and then the qualities you're looking for in a deaconess. And I think that's how most people believe we ought to translate that. Some people think it ought to be the qualities of the wife of a deacon. But even then, if it's that, it implies that the deaconess is in ministry with her husband. In Romans 16, of that greetings list, 9 of the 26 are women. That's a high percentage, isn't it? And in Acts, the widows, they tend to use their free time and their lack of having to look after their husband as an opportunity to go and do a whole lot of pastoral care in the church. And some of you are thinking to yourself, well, not much has changed. They carry the backbone of a lot of the church. What about women as deacons? So they're kind of workers and co-workers. We've just seen that Phoebe is also described as a deacon, so she holds some or other sort of an office in the church. Well, women also can be teachers and leaders. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, we're in Acts again, right? Apollos turns up particularly in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I follow Paul, I follow Peter, I follow Apollos. That's an impressive list, right? Paul plants a whole lot of the churches, and he's a great rhetorician, right? Gives an amazing speech in Athens. We'll get to that. Peter, well, he's one of the 12, and he preaches the sermon at Pentecost. Apollos must be a very, very good public speaker to have people in Corinth line up behind him, potentially over Paul and Apollos. Where does Apollos learn the gospel? And the answer is from a woman and her husband. When Priscilla and Aquila heard Apollos, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. Women teaching men. Here's Romans 15. Greet Andronicus and Junia. Andronicus is a male name, Junia is a female name. My fellow Jews who have been in prison with me, they are outstanding among the apostles. Can you join the dots there? Andronicus and Junia are amongst the apostles. Not the 12, but there are a wider group of people who are also called apostles. And in order to qualify as an apostle, you have to have met Jesus. Junia is a woman who is numbered amongst the apostles, who is one of these co-workers with Paul, to the extent that she has even been imprisoned because of her ministry. So we've now seen a deacon or a deaconess and a female apostle. And apostleship is not a small title. Part of what Paul struggles with in his letters is the fact that I have the status of an apostle. And you can trust me, that opens up certain doors and opportunities because actually I have met Jesus. So, repeatedly we see women doing some teaching. Lois and Eunice, the mother and the grandmother, teach Timothy. Older women are to teach younger women, 2 Timothy 2. Paul assumes that women can prophesy in 1 Corinthians 11. And remember, the prophecy is not just predicting the future, it's probably more so applying teachings to the current context. Philip has 4 daughters who prophesy. Junia is called an apostle. Let's come back to Phoebe. So Tom Wright, who I referenced last week, considered by most to be one of the New Testament experts in the world at the moment, he thinks that what's going on in Romans 16 is that Paul begins by mentioning Phoebe because Phoebe is the person who carries the letter to Rome. Greet her and open your doors and your hearts to her because she's bringing this message. Now, to be a first century carrier of a letter is more than just to be a mule or a donkey, right? You're actually more like, think, a town crier in the Middle Ages, where you actually carry the message and the authority of somebody else, and then you explain and you unpack that. So if Tom Wright is correct, and there's a little bit of speculation here, but if Tom Wright is correct, Paul chooses a female to bring what is his longest and most substantial theological letter to the people in Rome, to the centre of the empire. And as we've seen in Romans 16, 9 out of the 26 greetings are to women. So cumulatively, we're seeing that women can be teachers and teachers and leaders in the church. But let's cycle back, because he does say that stuff that I read at the start of the sermon. So Paul's view of women is more complex and more nuanced than I think being able to simply dismiss him as a misogynist or simply understanding him to be somebody who kind of like he is affirming the role of males and has nothing to say about females. So yes, whilst he's got women co-workers and he has them in positions of responsibility and influence, the husband remains the head. There's a sense of male headship that is part of Paul's continued teaching. And in the church, there appears to remain some level of male authority over females. Now's not the sermon to try and work out how those two intersect, but I just want to say that both themes are present in Paul. And biographically, I just want to note the fact that women are so repetitively present and prominent in his missionary journeys. And part of that, I think, is a double-edged sword. there's a sense in which perhaps because they have spiritual IQs that are more in tune to something new that's kind of happening, they get it a little bit quicker. But some commentators also suggest that there's a little bit of a theme in the New Testament of women, we ought to have them under male headship because they can actually be deceived like Eve was. And perhaps their spiritual awareness to new things might make them prone to being misled by false teaching if their spiritual IQ kind of gets pricked, but it's a little bit off centre. Perhaps that works as well. But Paul also affirms women as equal image bearers or as equal in Christ. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. Now, that's not to say male and female differences evaporate. Jewish and Gentile differences are no longer present, but they actually make no difference in terms of what it means for you to be somebody who is in Christ. In Christ, we are all the same. We are all equal. There are no differences in that sense. So what you get the picture of is that perhaps unlike the 21st century, there's lots of disputes going on in the first century church. Can we circumcise Gentiles or not? Are they welcome in? What kind of practices do we need to have? But one of the disputes is not the role of women. Or at least the text doesn't give us evidence that it is. What we get a picture is that women are active and men are active and they seem to be in ministry together, and this doesn't seem to be a source of division. Rather, they're actually working side by side bringing this new kingdom. And in that sense, Paul is a radical in his day. Let me pull together quickly some applications. Firstly, Paul is okay being out of step with his culture. Because we're in the book of Acts, a number of times I've highlighted to you the way that Paul contextualizes the gospel, right? So he's a farmer to the farmers, and he's a philosopher to the philosophers, and he's a Jew to the Jews. But he is not a misogynist to the misogynists and a feminist to the feminists. When he is amongst Christians and talking about how this kingdom actually works, it is otherworldly, right? Our hope is not in Caesar as Lord, it's in Jesus as Lord. And so therefore we give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but ultimately our sense of kingdom and fellowship is in Christ. And that tension will be the same today. We need to work out somehow how to be the 21st century church that is able to dialogue with the 21st century world, and yet we need to be otherworldly on about different things, living for different values and purposes. We don't water down the essence of the gospel or the kingdom so that somehow we become more appealing or more attractive. In fact, that actually doesn't work. Secondly, Paul is much maligned and misunderstood. I think when the feminist movements kind of were at their most fervent, and in our lifetimes we would have experienced that kind of between the 1960s and the 1980s or 90s or something like that, but there were previous versions of that. What happens at that moment in history is you kind of, when you work out actually as a culture we got it wrong, you've got to blame somebody. And inevitably, we end up blaming the generation before, right? And I think Paul has copped a lot of the blame for Western sexism. Oh, somehow we got that from Paul because he was a Christian and it was in the Bible and the Bible's ideas were our ideas, or whatever the logic is, right? But I think it's just flawed. I think it's unfair. Actually, and I'll tell you more about this later. If you want to read some more about this, it's in my book. I've recently published a book. There you go, slight promo. Much of Christian spirituality and practice is androgynous. The sense of being at the river to pray. and to worship and to open up your home and to evangelize and to care and to be hospitable and to be godly and to be different. That really doesn't matter whether you're a male or a female, right? It's not about, oh, well, you're a first or you're a second-class citizen. No, it's just like we're the people of God and we all are created in God's image and we're all called to reflect his likeness to the world, and we all do that together. And that's what you see going. That is the tone of how Paul's mission kind of happens, and I think that ought to be the tone of how mission and church is expressed in the 21st century. And lastly, I want to say we're also getting a sense that women have much, or perhaps I could have put something slightly unique to offer. I remember someone said to me once, a New Testament metaphor for the church, and there are many of them, but the most common one is church is family. And the picture is, imagine a family where you've got two dads, or conversely, two mums. Now, I get this is a little politically incorrect, but to be quite honest, I'm glad I didn't grow up in a family with two dads. And as I look at my children, I think they have been blessed by having a dad and a mum. And we play different roles in their lives. And you now see that with mobile phones, right? When I was young, I used to have to ring up my parents' landline, and whoever picked up the phone was who I had to talk to. It's not like that anymore. My children ring me for certain conversations, and they ring my wife for other conversations. And we are different voices who have different relationships with our children and speak into their lives in different places. And I think that is also true of church. There is a sense in which much of spirituality is androgynous, but some of it is females bringing more, shall we use the phrase, maternal giftings. And that makes church family. But in other ways, males also bring some more masculine giftings, and that also contributes to the church being family, and we need both of those. I remember growing up in a church that was all male leadership, and there were times where it was kind of clunky. And they could have benefited at times from a woman's touch in some of the ways that they handled some of their issues. And again, I think that's the picture that we're seeing, and that's the type of church that we want to celebrate. We're all one body, and we need everyone, and everyone's got gifts to bear, and some of those gifts are androgynous, and some of those gifts perhaps align with what it means to be created male and female. God created them both, and they both bear and reflect his image in similar and in different ways. And that's how we be the church.